very much. And I'd like to welcome my former professor, Mahar, my classmate, Mr. Nuki, and my former, in my past 40 years ago, my closest colleague, my Batman, and I was the Robin, si Dr. Herin. Ladies and gentlemen, let me see how this works. Ayaw. I don't see what. Ayaw.
Yes.
I thought that Gilbert was going to say something about the book, but since he forgot to say something about the book and who the audience was and what was the motivation, I will start with that. The book is about the unintended consequences of well-intentioned interventions. By interventions, we mean policies, programs, advocacies, and even ideas, proposals. And we look at how, give some examples to give you a feel about how prevalent it is and the importance of these unintended consequences. And we try to organize our thoughts so that we have some explanation of why they occur. No? And then how we can reduce injudicious decisions and interventions. What lessons can be learned so that hopefully we learn about avoiding at least some of them. So what motivated the book? One is we felt that we need to develop deeper evidence-based critical thinking, so going beyond good intentions. Because we felt that many of our public discussions of issues, when you watch TV, when you watch even some of the hearings in Congress, oftentimes they don't go much farther than statement of vision and objectives, and what the good intentions are of measures or policies, bills, laws, etc. And therefore, to strengthen appreciation of the value of evidence and critical thinking in a world of, using the new terms, alternative facts and post-truth era. And that's why we felt, we were already doing this when this thing about post-truth, alternative facts, sort of emerged. And where basically the last elections here in the US and in the US and here in the Philippines and even I think in France, I think you can sense a greater disrespect for evidence, facts, and even truth itself. So who is this book directed at? Well, the students, I think, was foremost in our minds. Because I think they still have hope that they can reshape the way they think, including the militant ones. Some policymakers, hopefully the young and supposedly non-traditional politicians, which I'm afraid, again, getting to know these young politicians, I feel like they are kind of not very far from the traditional politicians in terms of the way they think and approach public issues. And of course, we need to influence some of the voters themselves. in our view, democracy cannot work unless, you know, we have more voters who think critically and based on facts and evidence. Okay, so let me go to the substance of the book. It contains the 11 chapters, 10 case studies, and one synthesis. I'm supposed to talk about the synthesis chapter, which is co-authored with Dr. Roberta, and we fondly call him Babes. And Gilbert, although his real name really is Gilberto, and Maribel Dangaluna as co-authors of the synthesis chapter. And the 10 chapters, let me introduce, because I think that it's just oftentimes the three of us, Gilbert, Babes, and I, are kind of put in the limelight. But actually, this really is a teamwork. And that includes various colleagues who authored and co-authored the various chapters. So chapter 2 is authored by Dr. Lianto. And then the third, which is about the impact of legal minimum wage on employment, income, and poverty incidence in the Philippines, which I co-authored with Dr. Beta and Butch Lanzona. Butch, where are you? Ah, there he is. He is professor of Ateneo, but by origin he's from the School of Economics. So you have you have chosen well to be trained at the School of Economics and teach at Ateneo. Economist na talaga, marunong mag-calculate where the advantages are. Okay, the fourth is about the trading off of worker flexibility for job security, missed opportunities for more and better jobs. I co-authored that with Butch. And the next is what the beware of the end of contractualization battle cry, which of course is a hot topic even now. But people who disagree with me, I hope they are here, are welcome. Very, very welcome. Then the sixth, you have food insecurity and the price of rice self-sufficiency by the well, Briones, who is of course the expert here in agriculture, particularly rice. And I think he will announce later about some small victories. That's why they were late. Okay, and then beyond the rent, studying the unintended consequences of housing rent control law in Metro Manila by Dr. Ballesteros, we finally call her Teng, and Tatum Ramos. Both the rice paper and this paper on housing will be given some special space in this launch to highlight in more detail these two articles, two issues. And then we have a study of two studies related to the environment. One on the wood industry and forestry. It's called Planting Seeds of Self-Defeat, Effects of Unrealistic Regulations on the Caraga Wood Industry and Forest Conservation. This is about Executive Order 23. or notoriously called total love ban. Okay, and I co-authored that with Danny Israel, one of our fellows here at PITS. Then we have another something that's related to the environment, reducing the unintended consequences of open access, lesson from the Zamboanga experience. This one is has a positive twist to it in the sense that it provides an interesting solution to a problem in the Philippines, which is overfishing. Then you have Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino, Boon or Bane, by Babes and myself. As you know, this is of course controversial, and some people want to either abolish it or defund it or reduce funding in favor of some pie in the sky jobs program. And then you have the last one, I think, is the irony of the RH law. RH law critics opposition to comprehensive sex education. And with Michael Abigo, our new PhD. Michael, where are you? There he is, young man. You look like me when I was younger. Okay, and this one is about is a good example of how really, and this is, we chose this because it's not just economics. There is some economics to it, but it's a social issue. Just to essentially allow us to highlight the fact that PIDS is about not just economics, but about social issues, development issues, broadly conceived to include not just economics, but other aspects of human development. Okay, so that's the chapters and the authors. Okay. So in summary, our thesis can be caricatured by this graph. And essentially, well, we said, so do unintended consequences matter? And essentially, what we're, of course, saying here is, don't mind who that man looks like. It looks like somebody that you're familiar with. And so it is about certain like increased minimum wages, abolition of contractual temporary contracts, the imposition of cargo truck ban. What else is there? Trade restrictions on rice, etc. And all this, when you put them together, have really huge effects on, I think, on the welfare of people. So, and it is a way of showing the boomerang effect. I use the word boomerang because we have guests from Australia. That's their national toy, right? Okay. So, and then we talk about, so before maybe if I still have time, let me just go briefly, like in, before talking about the synthesis chapter, just describe very briefly what the unintended consequence of, or consequences of laid out in these various chapters, and to give you a sense that they are indeed foolishness or injudicious decisions. So in the cargo truck ban, basically I think you guys will still remember. It was what, a year or two ago? Was it 2 years ago? 2014, where basically trucks were banned from certain major thoroughfares in Metro Manila, and that Manila, and that created a big problem in terms of getting the goods from the warehouse to their destination, and in the calculation of Gilbert, that cost billions of pesos for a measly gain of several minutes of time saved for each commuter. So I think the estimate was about 45 billion pesos for that short span of time, because they realized that it was just simply kind of, to use the word, a folly, to be saving that little time saved from the ban, and yet it's costing you billions and billions of pesos lost. So that's that analysis, and essentially the point that's being made here is a little bit more kind of study about the cost and benefit of that, and it was not hard to do. Even some rough calculation can tell you that it was a stupid thing to do. Okay, so on the impact of the legal minimum wages on employment, income, and poverty incidents in the Philippines, every year we see this demand for hefty increases of in minimum wages, and going beyond the productivity growth of labor, as well as going beyond the rate of inflation. So they are asking sometimes 35% or so. And the conventional wisdom, at least among the advocates, is that that's going to help the poor workers, and that so you see that those who are well off actually have higher wages. But as we'll see later, this is really like jumping to conclusion. What we show here is, in fact, that this rapid regions that have imposed rapid increases in minimum wages, legal minimum wages, actually did experience higher poverty rates. There's an explanation for that, and part of that explanation is that the opportunities for employment within the family is less. So, although it could increase the wage rates of those who remain employed, there are those within the family who are actually either were disemployed, or their opportunity to be employed is less. So you can see empirically, using difference in difference kind of methodologies, that it had a negative impact. That is, it raised the prevalence rate of poverty, and the average income of people fell as a result. Now, the other thing that is worth noting here is that there were other studies that actually kind of align with this story, and that is, for example, there's a study, a thesis at the UP School of Economics that showed that hours of work was reduced. Of those workers who are still working, their hours of work were reduced as a result of minimum wage increase. And this one used the quasi-experimental method. I was mentioning this because we tried to be evidence-based, based on credible methodologies. And then, what Butch Lanzona had another paper which we cite, which shows that the impact differs depending on which groups of the demographic groups. And these demographic groups that were impacted negatively, I mean their employment probabilities were those, the young, the women, the less educated and inexperienced. In other words, those segments of the population that have less human capital, which of course theory will tell you which should be the case. That you will be the one, with theirs lining up, those that are less productive will have to go first. So that is clearly shown by the empirical evidence in this particular case. Lastly, I'd like to mention also Butch found that the impact on the employment demand of firms differ. Among the big companies, the impact is positive. So it actually forced them to employ more or give them opportunities to employ more. But for the bulk of our enterprises, small and medium scale enterprises, the impact on employment demand has been significantly negative. Maybe they are less capable, they don't have the money to hire in the face of high wages. So you can see the very people and companies that you want to protect are the ones hurt. Okay? So ito is a very clear example of how the very people that you want to protect supposedly are getting hurt by an intervention for lack of more critical evidence-based thinking. In the case of trading of worker flexibility for security missed opportunities, essentially this is a study on what's the impact of the BOI incentives, fiscal impacts essentially, where they were giving, the incentive was something like less taxes or even no taxes when you import machinery and other goods, intermediate inputs, in order to try to counter the distortions of the policies related to trade. No? And the result here is essentially to show that well, the motivation of those incentives, of the BOI incentives, was to stimulate expansion of jobs, supposedly. But it turns out that output of the companies who were intended beneficiaries of these incentives, well, they expanded their output, all right, but jobs did not increase. And the reason is that they were actually switching from labor-intensive to much more capital-intensive processes, because now it is cheaper to import machinery. Right? So again, that shows you how, sort of unintended consequences could actually, if you're not careful at the kind of incentives that you are putting in place with that intervention, that you might be veering away from the very objective that you want to reach. Okay, so then you have beware of end of contractualization battle, and here essentially what what we're showing here is not so much the endo. I think what our position was, the endo is the law of the land. If you have that, if you've decided that that's the law, then you must enforce it. To respect the majesty of the law. But having said that, there are bills in Congress right now that basically wants to totally ban all forms of temporary employment contracts. And our point here is that temporary employment contracts have roles to play that facilitate the efficient functioning and even the equitable functioning of the labor market. And that if you make the system less flexible in the ability of firms to hire and fire, or even to just use temporary employment contracts, that could actually have also unintended consequence. In this case, we show that at least in the literature, and we did some empirical work, that basically the temporary employment contracts are used or are useful as platforms for people with poor credentials or talents that are hidden, and it's not known, and they don't have the credentials because they didn't go to Ateneo, or they did not go to LaSalle or UP. So in the queue, they are the last ones, essentially. But they are actually talented, but hidden. Their talents are hidden. So it's also it's a filter or a screening device, in effect, that allows the employers to know more the worker, not just in terms of his skills, but actually his attitudes towards work. Does he go to work regularly, or marunong ba makisama? Does he know how to treat people right? Okay, and sometimes when they're still temporary, they're fine, no? But then when you make them regular, their horns show. So what happens is, in effect, those who get screened away when you force a premature kind of a regularization is for the firm to select those that have better credentials to ensure productivity and to ensure the probability that they are not going to be stuck or have so-called be locked in this particular guy who might turn out to be really a bad apple. Okay, so it has some impact. The other thing that I want to mention is that in this, as a comment to the anti-contractualization movement, is that actually for me is worrisome, because they actually show an opposite trend than what has happened, for example, in Europe, which is Europe experienced couple of decades ago when it was experiencing what is known as the Eurosclerosis, the hardening of the labor market system in Europe, and that basically led to what I think people here have been calling jobless growth. No, I mean, a year or so ago, people were talking about the Philippines as having or experiencing jobless growth, where economic growth was accelerating, but jobs were not growing that fast. So what they did was actually to reverse their policy trend, which is they liberalized the rules about temporary employment contracts. And lo and behold, the study has shown that, in fact, it improved the employment rate, the situation. So, and by the way, the transition rate from temporary to regular or permanent, the Philippine numbers, the rates in the Philippines, is not that, it is within the range that are observed in Europe. So we're not really that bad in terms of comparable international standards. Okay, what else? Okay, number 7 is about the low income housing rent control. Peng will be talking about that, so I'm not going to summarize it. So I'm not going to steal the suspense from her presentation. Planting the seeds of self-defeat, effects of unrealistic regulations in the Caraga industry. Here, this is again a case where basically, in response to the big floods, because of the typhoons, the Aquino administration imposed rather rashly, with very little consultation, imposed this Executive Order 23. And essentially established certain rules. One of which is moratorium on the giving of new licenses for wood processing industries, and so new entry, as well as they made it very difficult to renew licenses. Now, there are a couple of things that I want to highlight here. One is that that has resulted, in high rent-seeking behavior, as you would expect, when you make it very difficult to get licenses, etc., and to transport logs. And by the way, in Caraga, 95% of the logs that are used in the wood processing industry are already planted, commercial trees. Okay, so like I plant trees. I have my commercial farm, so I know this this thing. And when you transport from your tree plantation to the wood processing plant, you have to pay some money, not insubstantial, from the permit to transport to the number of checkpoints. The number of checkpoints has blossomed after EO 23, from maybe 3 to 4 to about 15 to 20 checkpoints, involving almost everybody, from the barangay captain to the police to the DNR, etc. That is the effect of that. So, but leave that aside. They actually have a situation where, because of this rent-seeking behavior, they actually give papers to those without the commercial tree plantation, use the sort of a fake kind of document, so that those that are actually illegally cutting from the natural forest, they can transport the logs that they cut illegally from the natural forest. And therefore, what I'm saying is that, in fact, those that are supposed to be in charge of controlling the illegal logging are the ones providing the documentation for them to be able to transport these logs. So, what I want to say is that has been little impact on the conservation of this so-called residual or remaining natural growth forest, but at the same time, you are actually reducing the number of wood processing plants from about 127 to about 27, or 120 something to just 27. And you say, why? After all, this seems to be based on an old-fashioned model like the old BOI, where you have a certain, you link the number of entrants or firms in the industry on the basis of so-called measured capacity. In this case, the capacity of the local log industry, the capacity of the forest to provide logs to the industry. But you can always import now. You can import from Vietnam. You can import from, so there should be no should be very little, at least, linkage between the number of wood processing plants and the available number of trees from the remaining forest. Okay, so then we have the Zamboanga experience. Essentially, here it is about overfishing, especially when they had this sardines factory were established there. And they realized that the sardines were getting smaller over time, which is a sign, a sure sign that the sardines could no longer grow their young to become adults and be able to reproduce. So down the line, 5 minutes, okay. Down the line, they would expect that these sardines in that area will go to extinction. So, but this is the classic economic case of open access. So, open access will allow you to really overuse your natural resources. But the solution here, which is interesting to compare between the Caraga solution and the Zamboanga solution, is that in the Zamboanga solution, they actually got together those that have stakes and interest in ensuring that sardines continue to survive and provide them the input. They figure out and they said, well, let's have a closed season for several months to allow the young to grow into adulthood and be able to reproduce. And so, sure enough, months later, or a year or so later, the sardines, the number, were back to a sustainable level. Okay? So, and then maybe I will go to the Pamilya Pilipino here. Bon Urbane is essentially, as I mentioned, the opposition here is that is grounded on one, because it does not provide great jobs, and supposedly it is supposed to lead to dependency and mendicant attitude from this assistance from the government, cash assistance from the government, and so some groups wanted it to be defunded. Okay, and it's not just the left; it's also the right, the extreme right. And here we showed, and by the way, Dr. Orbeta evaluated this program using RCT, or the experimental control method, and showed that it had positive impact in terms of the children getting basic health services, and at the same time improving the school enrollment rate of children, and even also improve the self-rated poverty rate, that measure of poverty that SWS, particularly Mahar, has developed. So that had been reduced as a result of this Pantawid benefit program benefits. So what is the unintended consequences? Well, what we're saying is, had the opponents or the critics been successful, before that, there's also no evidence that there is a negative impact on the labor force behavior, attitude, etc. In other words, they work as hard as before. In fact, there is some kind of evidence that shows that they're actually looking for more work, those beneficiaries of Pantawid. Problema, they cannot find work. So, but the bottom line is, it does not hurt the ethics, the work ethics of people. So, had they been successful in cutting back or defunding this program, it would have hurt the poor because it was helping them in the first place. Okay, the 11th one, the last one is the about sex education, comprehensive sex education mandated by the RH law. Essentially, for conservatives have been opposing that, and for their good, yeah, they have some good reasons for it. I mean, but at this point, I'm not going to quarrel about their reasons, but only to point out that in reality, empirically, yung kinatakutan nila, what they were afraid of is to encourage promiscuity, okay, and early coital initiation. So, what happened actually, cover your ears. Oh, sorry. Buti na lang, I did not say pagtatalik. Okay, so what we find here is that actually those that were not exposed to sexual education actually tended to have early anong tawag natin doon? Yeah, have early experience, shall we say. You know what I mean. Have earlier experience, and also actually had earlier age of teenage pregnancy, right? And so it is counter to what has been expected by keeping them in the dark about sexuality education. Now, and then down the line, what you'll find is that actually the educational attainment of this less informed youth eventually was less than the educational attainment of the more informed group. And yeah, there could be many reasons for that related to having more appropriate sexual behavior. Okay, so maybe during the question and answer, you could maybe just ask the various authors about, Michael is there to answer about sex. Okay. Let me just end this by okay. So they said, if unintended consequences can hurt people, why do they occur? Essentially, and we look at three in the literature frameworks. One is the sociological framework of Merton, which lists sources of unintended consequences, factors of unintended consequences, and they include ignorance, error, imperious immediacy of interest, self-defeating predictions, etc. And then you have the standard political economy theory, which basically says public decisions are the results of political calculation about who gains and who loses from the intervention. And the last one, which is the more interesting one, but I don't have time anymore, unfortunately, but you can ask me later, is Kahneman's thinking fast and slow, which basically says that injudicious decisions are due to the way our minds have evolved and allowed us to survive, which means there are two parts of our brains. One is the so-called System 1, and the other one is System 2. System 1, you can call the intuitive, instinctive part of the brain, which allows you to react quickly, decide quickly, even for lack of information, for you to survive. Hindi mo kailangan magka-calculate pa kung meron ka ng tiger dyan na atake sa'yo. No? The other one is called System 2, which essentially is the Homo economicus, essentially, which means the thinking, rational, critical part that looks for evidence, very calculating, and try to control System 1. Okay? So with that, I'll end my discussion, but ask me about it because I have some very interesting things to say about Kahneman's new way of looking at the way humans think and decide. Thank you.